Blood was the last thing Harlan Mercer expected to smell on his wedding day. He had ordered a wife from a catalog out of Chicago. He had expected calico and quiet company, a second voice in a cabin that had gone silent enough over 10 years to make a man forget the sound of his own name. He had expected someone to sit in the second chair. Instead, he found her half buried under a rotting pine at the bottom of the mountain, her lungs rattling like dry leaves in a dead wind, and he had been waiting 3 months for the privilege. Frost coated the coarse hairs of the mule's ears, standing them up in stiff white spikes. Harlan shifted in the saddle, and the frozen leather groaned under his weight, a sound he usually paid no mind to, and that today grated on him like a rusted saw drawn across a nail. He dragged a thick, cracked hand down his face and felt 3 days of hard riding ground into his beard. His knuckles were split and weeping thin lines that dried black in the wind. He was a fool. That was the only honest conclusion left to him. A 30-year-old fool who had sent $50 in hard-won gold dust to a proxy agency in Chicago, asking for a woman willing to live at 9,000 feet, in the Bitterroots in Idaho, at the top of the world, where the air was thin and the winters were longer than some men's whole lives. He had built a second chair for the cabin. That was the part he kept coming back to. He had built the thing with his own hands over 2 evenings, planed the seat smooth and set it across the table from his own, and he had not sat in his own chair since. Because sitting in one chair with an empty one facing you is a worse loneliness than sitting alone in a cabin with only one chair in it. An empty chair is a promise the world has not kept. For 3 months he had ridden down to the valley every other week and stood at the edge of the Mercantile and watched the stage come in, watched it spit out prospectors and drummers and leave again empty. And every time he had ridden the long climb back up to his claim with the second chair sitting there, facing nothing. Now the sky over the Bitterroots was the color of a bruised iron skillet, low and heavy and swollen with the first real blizzard of the winter. Winter did not announce itself up here. It slammed the door shut and trapped whatever was left inside. Stay by the fire with us tonight, friend, and see this one through to the end. And tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from, so we can see how far this story travels. He had gotten the truth out of the stage driver in a saloon in town 3 days back. He had pinned the man's sleeve to the bar with one hand until he stammered it out. Left her at Miller's Crossing, the driver said. She said someone was coming for her. We were running late. Weather coming down off the South Ridge, and it ain't my fault, mister, if your mail-order bride got cold feet and lit out east on the next coach. Miller's Crossing was not a town. It was not even a settlement. It was a rotting timber relay shack with a caved-in roof and a corral of splintered pine poles, and it stank of old ash and coyote. Harlan rode into the little clearing, and the silence pressed in on him, heavy and total. The wind died for a moment, and in that vacuum the complete absence of any living human being was loud as a shout. He swung down. His boots broke through the crust of snow. He tied the mule to the ruin of the hitching post, and he did not pull his repeater from the saddle scabbard, because if there had been anyone here to fear, the cold had long since driven them off or killed them. The shack door hung off one rusted leather hinge. He nudged it with his boot, and it fell inward with a crack, kicking up a cloud of frozen dust. Nothing inside but rat droppings and the skeleton of an old nest. He stepped back out with his jaw tight and felt the hot, familiar spike of anger in his chest. Not at her, at himself. She had taken one look at the brutal gray face of this country and paid the next stage east, and it was the smart thing to do, and he could not even blame her for it. He turned to make the long, bitter climb back to his solitary claim. And that was when the color caught his eye. Over past the collapsed corral 50 yards into the tree line, a splash of something that did not belong against the endless gray and white. Harlan frowned. His hand dropped without his telling it to the cold iron on his hip, and he moved toward it slow, his boots breaking the snow in a steady rhythm. The shape became a steamer trunk. The canvas was slashed. The brass clasps beaten in with a rock. Thin, useless cotton dresses lay scattered around it, a pair of wool stockings, a crushed bonnet, all of it half buried and frozen stiff. Harlan crouched and pulled off his right glove with his teeth and ran his bare fingers over the slashed canvas. The edges were frozen hard. This had not happened today. Not yesterday. Then he smelled it. Under the sharp tang of pine and cold stone, something heavy and sour. Sickness, old sweat. And underneath that, faint and unmistakable, the metal smell of blood. Harlan stood slowly, and his eyes went to the tree line, and he saw it. The snow was disturbed. A drag mark, mostly filled in by the recent flurries, led away from the trunk into a dense stand of deadfall pine. He did not run. Running is how a man twists an ankle in country like this. He walked, following the faint trouble in the snow, and the smell grew, and under the root ball of a great overturned fir, he found a hollow scraped out of the earth. A desperate, pathetic attempt at a den. She was in it. She was not wearing calico. She was wrapped in a filthy, mud-caked wool coat 3 sizes too big for her, scavenged. Her knees pulled up hard against her chest, and her face buried in the collar, and she was so still that for one long and terrible moment Harlan Mercer was certain he had ridden 3 days to bury a stranger. "Hey," he said. His voice came out a harsh gravel scrape in the quiet. She did not move. He cursed under his breath and stepped down into the hollow, his boots sinking into the soft rotted earth beneath the snow, and he reached down and took hold of the shoulder of that oversized coat to pull her out into the light. The moment his hand closed on the fabric, she convulsed. It was not a gentle waking. It was a violent shudder, and a low, wet, tearing cough ripped out of her, and she rolled onto her back, and her face came into the gray light filtering down through the pine boughs, and Harlan felt his stomach drop clean out of him. Her skin was the color of old tallow, stretched so tight over the bones of her face that he could see the shape of the skull beneath it. Her lips were cracked and had gone a terrible faint blue at the edges. A dark bruise spread across the left side of her jaw, yellowing sick and green at its border. Her eyes came open, but they did not find him. They rolled loose in their sockets, unmoored from the world entirely. "Been waiting," she rasped. Her voice was nothing but dry wind over stone. Harlan stared down at her. He did not feel a surge of heroism. He did not feel love strike him like lightning. He felt a deep and total exhaustion settle into his marrow. He had spent 3 months waiting for a partner to help him carry the load, and the world, in its usual way, had dropped a dying woman at his feet instead. "Damn it all," he whispered, and the words came out on a ragged breath, and they hung there in the freezing air. He did not want this. He did not want to watch a woman die. He did not want to dig a grave in frozen ground and carry her ghost around his cabin for the rest of his life. The hard, practiced part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive 10 years in this country, told him plainly that she was too far gone, that the sickness had deep hooks in her chest, that he could hear it in the wet, drowning sound of every breath she took, and that moving her would likely only kill her faster. His boots stayed planted in the mud. He dropped to his knees and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Her skin was terribly hot. A dry, papery burning that was entirely wrong against the freezing air, and her pulse fluttered against his fingers fast and thin and erratic, like a bird beating itself against a window. "What's your name?" he said. not because he expected an answer, but because the silence of those woods had grown too heavy to bear. The letter had said Cora. "You Cora?" She shivered, a full and violent tremor that rattled her teeth, and she turned her face away and burrowed it back down into the filthy collar. "Don't," she whispered. "Took the money. Just go." Delirium, she was living some nightmare all over again. And Harlan understood, kneeling in that hollow, that the stage driver had left out the worst of it. Someone had waited here for her. Someone had smashed her trunk and struck her down and left her in the snow to die, and the smart, clean anger of that did not light any fire of vengeance in him. It only confirmed what he already knew about the world. Men were bastards. Cold killed. Gravity pulled everything down in the end. Nobody's taking anything else from you, Harlan grunted. And he made his decision, though he would have been hard put to say when exactly he made it. He got a fire going in that hollow, snapping dead limbs off the fallen fir, cursing the wind that snuffed his first 2 matches, cupping his big hands around the third until the pine needles caught and sent up a thin ribbon of gray smoke. He fed it up until it cracked and hissed, and the small heat did nothing at all against the vast cold. But it threw enough light to work by. He pulled his heavy bear-hide coat off his own shoulders. The cold came into his flannel shirt at once, sinking its teeth in, and he bit back a word and draped that great foul-smelling hide over her shaking body. "Drink," he ordered, uncorking his canteen and getting an arm under her shoulders. She was dead weight, her head lolling. He pressed the metal rim to her cracked lips, and the water spilled, and she gagged, and her eyes shot open, and for 1 second they found him. She looked at his huge bearded face, at the old scar cutting through his left eyebrow, at the sheer size of the man holding her, and pure animal panic flared in her. She brought her hands up and pushed at his chest. It was like a child trying to push over an anvil. "No," she wheezed. "Stop fighting, woman," Harlan snapped, harsher than he meant to. "I ain't going to hurt you. I'm Harlan. Harlan Mercer. I sent the letter. The name did not land anywhere." Her eyes rolled back and she went limp against his arm, and the first fat flakes of snow began to come down, sticking to the sleeves of his shirt. He could not stay. The fire would never hold her through the night, and if this dumped 2 feet the mule would not make the climb tomorrow. It was now, or it was never. "All right, Cora," he muttered. "This ain't going to be pretty." He got her up over the pommel and swung up behind her and pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his left arm around her to hold her from sliding, taking the reins in his right. Her head fell back against his shoulder. He could feel the sharp ridges of her ribs knocking weakly against his forearm with every breath, and she was so light, so terribly fragile, that a kind of fear he had not felt in years moved through him. "Don't die on me before we get to the top," he said to the howling wind. "I ain't digging a grave in the dark." And he put the mule up the mountain into the coming storm. The snow came not in flakes, but in hard, driving pellets that stung his face like thrown salt. The wind shifted and screamed down the canyon. The trail, barely a rut in summer, vanished under drifting white, and every step the mule took was a negotiation with gravity and death. His left arm went numb around her within the hour. He could not feel whether he was gripping her coat or her flesh. He locked the joint into a rigid, painful bracket, and he held on. And he talked to her the whole way up, not because she could hear him, but because a man alone in a killing storm needs the sound of a voice, even his own. "Built you a chair," he told her at one point, when the wind let up enough to speak. 2 evenings' work. Good pine. Been sitting there empty 3 months. He shifted her weight against his chest. "You're going to sit in it. You hear me? You don't get to come all this way and die and leave that chair empty. That ain't how this goes." She did not answer. Her breath rattled against him, wet and uneven, but it kept coming, and as long as it kept coming, he kept climbing. They reached the cabin somewhere in the black heart of the night. Harlan did not pause to catch his breath. Survival up here was a checklist, and he was already behind on it. Fire first. He got the stove going with kindling and 3 splits of seasoned birch, his half-frozen fingers dropping the first 2 matches before the 3rd caught. Then, the girl. There was no room in it for modesty, and no time for it either. Her clothes were a freezing wet tomb, and they were going to kill her faster than the fever if he left them on. He cut the ruined coat away with his hunting knife and the soaked dress under it, peeling the frozen fabric back, and the smell of sickness rose off her. And he did not let himself flinch from it. And when he had her down to where he could see, he stopped, and his breath caught. The agency had sent him a photograph of a smiling, round-cheeked woman in a high-collared blouse. What lay on his bed was a skeleton, wrapped in bruised parchment. Her left collarbone jutted up at a wrong, sharp angle, the skin over it stretched taut and purple. A great black-yellow bruise spanned the whole right side of her ribs, and in the middle of it, stamped clear into the flesh, was the shape of a boot heel. Someone had not just robbed this woman, someone had tried to stamp the life out of her on the ground. Harlan Mercer stood over her in the firelight and felt something old and cold turn over in his chest, something harder than pity. And he filed it away for later, because right now she was dying, and rage does not bring down a fever. He threw a wool blanket over her and tucked it tight, and he dragged the second chair, the one he had built for her, over to the side of the bed, and he sat down in it to begin the longest night of his life. He was a man who could track a bull elk through miles of black timber. He could patch a sod roof and live for weeks on pemmican and melted snow. He had no idea in this world how to fix a broken human being. So he did the only things he knew. He built the stove up until the cabin turned into a stifling wet box, because he needed to bake the frost out of her marrow, even if it half killed the both of them. He stripped off his own soaked shirt and sat bare to the waist in the roaring heat, with sweat running down his scarred ribs. He steeped willow bark in boiling water until the whole cabin stank bitter, and he pinned her thrashing arm gently to the mattress and forced the hot, bitter liquid past her teeth a swallow at a time, while she coughed and fought him and called him by another man's name. "Arthur," she shrieked once, her good hand balling into a weak fist and striking his shoulder. "I'll cut your throat, Arthur. I won't let you." Even broken, even starving and half dead, the woman fought. It was not the weak flailing of a victim. It was pure, raw refusal to die, and Harlan absorbed the blows and held her down with immovable hands until the burst of it wore out and she collapsed weeping, the tears cutting clean tracks through the soot and dirt on her face. He wet a rag and wiped them away as clumsily as a bear handling an egg. His hands were too big and too rough, and he knew he was scraping her, but he did not know how to be gentler. "Nobody's cutting anybody's throat," he said, and his gravel voice dropped low, into a register he had not used since his hunting dog died on him 5 winters back. "Arthur ain't here. Just me. Just the mountain." She did not hear him. She slid back down into the dark, muttering fever, and Harlan sat back in the second chair, exhausted, his hands stained with her blood and the brown residue of the willow bark. He was a man who liked equations that came out clean. Wood and fire made heat. Bullet and deer made meat. Winter and carelessness made death. This woman defied every rule he had. She should have been dead days ago. The cold should have taken her. The sickness should have drowned her lungs. And yet her heart, fluttering like a trapped moth against a window pane, simply would not stop. He leaned his head back against the rough log wall and closed his eyes, and the wind battered the cabin, and he dozed in fitful 10-minute pieces, jerking awake every time her breathing changed its pitch. There had been a time, a long way back, when Harlan Mercer had not been a man who lived alone on top of a mountain. He did not think about it often, because thinking about it did no good, and he was a man who had little patience for things that did no good. But that night, sitting in the dark with a dying stranger's breath rattling a few feet away, it came up in him unbidden. The way the worst things do when a man is too tired to hold the door on them. Her name had been Ruth, and she had come west with him 15 years ago, when he was young and stupid and full of the belief that wanting a thing badly enough was the same as being able to keep it. They had not made it 2 years. The fever that came through the mining camp in the winter of the bad snow took her in 9 days, the same way this sickness was trying to take the woman in his bed, and Harlan had buried his wife in ground he'd had to thaw with a fire before he could dig it. And then he had done the only thing he knew how to do, which was to go up. Up and up, until the country got so high and so hard that nothing could live in it that was not willing to fight for every single day. And there, at 9,000 feet, he had built a cabin and a life with no room in it for anyone else, because a life with no room in it for anyone else is a life that cannot be taken from you. He'd had a dog for a while, a big rangy hound that had followed him up the mountain out of the valley one spring and stayed. The dog had been the one living thing Harlan let himself talk to in 10 years. And when it died, 5 winters back, old and stiff and quiet, curled up by the stove where it liked to lie, Harlan had felt the loss of it in a way that frightened him, because it told him the door he'd shut on the world was not as sealed as he'd believed. He had ordered a wife from a catalog because a man cannot talk to a dog forever, and because the second chair had started to feel less like furniture and more like an accusation. And now there was a woman in his bed who might die before morning, and Harlan Mercer sat in the dark and understood that he had spent 10 years building a wall specifically so that he would never again have to sit up through a night like this one, and that the wall had turned out to be no wall at all. It had just been a longer way around to the same place. He got up and put another split on the fire. And somewhere near dawn, the light in the cabin changed. The fierce orange of the stove gave way to a pale, bruised gray coming through the rawhide window. Harlan jerked awake with his neck cramped and his heart giving a rare heavy thump, because the bed had gone quiet. She lay perfectly still under the blankets, and for one terrible second he was sure the quiet meant the fight was over and he had lost it. He leaned forward and pressed the back of his knuckles to her forehead. The terrible dry heat was gone. Her skin was damp with a cooling sweat, clammy but blessedly, ordinarily cool. The fever had broken. Her eyelashes fluttered. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes, and they were not cloudy anymore. They were a sharp pale green, the color of new pine needles, and they were entirely, finally lucid. She did not look around the room. She looked straight at him. At his massive, scarred face, at his bare chest smeared with dirt and dried medicine, at the size of him folded into a chair beside her bed. She swallowed hard and winced at it. "Am I in hell?" she whispered, in a voice like grinding stone. Harlan Mercer let out a long, slow breath, and a tired, crooked thing that was almost a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Close," he rasped. "You're in Idaho." Morning broke hard and crystalline and blinding. Snow had drifted halfway up the single window, burying the bottom pane in solid white, and inside the cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee going over the top of the pot. Harlan stood at the stove with his back to the bed, turning thick slabs of salt pork in a skillet, when he heard the dry rustle of the blankets. "Where are my clothes?" she said. Her voice was a thready scrape. He slid the skillet off the heat and turned, wiping his hands on a rag. She had pushed herself up onto her elbows, and it had plainly cost her everything she had. Her face was chalk. The bruises stood out sickening in the harsh light. She had the quilt clutched to her chin with white-knuckled fingers. "Burn them," Harlan said flatly. "Soaked through and stinking of sickness. You'd have frozen inside your own clothes." Panic flared bright and feral in the green eyes. She looked frantically around the small, hard, masculine room, the trap lines hanging from the rafters, the repeater by the door, and back to the scarred bulk of him. "You," she started, her breath hitching wet in her throat. "Did you?" "No." He cut her off flat, without heat. He crossed to the table and picked up a tin plate. He did not offer her soft reassurance. He was not built for it, and she would not have believed it anyway. "Stripped you down to find the bleeding. Boiled rags to clean your ribs. That's the whole of it. I have got neither the time nor the inclination to take advantage of a half-dead woman." He dropped a slab of pork onto the plate and a hard biscuit beside it, and carried it over with a chipped mug of black coffee, and set it on the stool by the bed. "Eat," he ordered. "Or don't. But if you starve to death after I spent a whole night fighting that fever off you, I'll be sore about it." She stared at the greasy meat, and her stomach cramped so hard, her eyes watered. She reached a trembling hand out from under the quilt and closed her clumsy fingers around the warm mug and brought it to her lips, and drank. It was scalding and bitter as ash, and the finest thing she had ever tasted in her life. "Who's Arthur?" Harlan said. He had pulled the second chair around backward and straddled it, resting his heavy forearms across the back of it. Cora froze. The mug rattled once against her teeth. She lowered it slowly, and the fight drained out of her all at once, replaced by a hollow, bottomless tiredness. "My brother," she whispered. Harlan did not react. He watched the steam come off his own coffee. "He didn't want me to come out here," she said, and her voice went flat and empty. "Said mail-order brides were just women too cowardly to work an honest parlor. He came with me. Said he'd see me settled." A bitter thing twisted her cracked lips. "We got off the stage at that crossing, and he told the driver someone was waiting for us, and once the coach was gone, he took my travel bag, and he smashed the trunk." She touched her bruised jaw and winced. "Said I wasn't going to take the family savings out here to hand to some dirt-scratching miner in the mountains." "You had the money," Harlan said, sewn into the lining of my good coat, a humorless smile. He knew. He always knew where I kept things. That's the thing about family. They know exactly where you're soft. Harlan turned this over in silence. He thought about the $50 in gold dust he had sent to Chicago, gone now, into the pocket of a greedy brother. He looked at the broken, starving woman in his bed, and he understood that he had not bought himself a wife. He had inherited a casualty of somebody else's cruelty. "Well," he grunted, standing up and taking his plate. "He didn't hit you hard enough." Cora looked up, startled, and for a second anger flashed hot in her eyes, burning off the last of the fever fog. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He walked back to the stove. "He left you alive. Foolish mistake in this country." He did not look back at her. "Means you get to eat my salt pork and take my bed, and once those ribs knit, you can earn your keep mending my shirts." He heard, behind him, the distinct and satisfying crunch of her teeth going into the hard biscuit, followed by a soft-pained groan as she chewed. "I don't know how to mend shirts," she said between careful bites, and her tone had gone suddenly dry, matching his own. "You'll learn," Harlan said, chewing his own tough pork. "Or we'll both freeze to death in rags. Your choice." He went to the frosted window and scraped a small circle clear with his thumbnail. Outside, the blizzard raged on, a blinding wall of white, that had sealed them off from the whole rest of the world and buried the pines in suffocating drifts. There was no going down the mountain. There was no sending her back to Chicago or to whatever life she had fled. Winter had shut the heavy timber door and thrown the bar across it. They were stuck with each other. Two strangers, both of them battered and cheated by the world, sealed together in a 10-by-10 box of sap weeping pine. Harlan glanced back over his shoulder. She was chewing grimly, her green eyes fixed on the fire, refusing to die, refusing to weep about it, just eating his 3-day-old biscuit like it was a job of work that needed doing. He had built a second chair. Somebody was finally going to sit in it. The recovering took the better part of 3 weeks, and it did not make them friends. It made them something harder to name than that, and slower, and in the end more durable. The ribs came first, because a person cannot do anything while their ribs are stove in. Harlan had wrapped them, badly, and Cora rewrapped them herself once her hands worked again, which they did before the rest of her, because hands are the last thing to quit and the first thing to come back. She was not a soft woman. He had gathered that in the first hour. Whatever softness she had brought west with her had been beaten out of her at Miller's Crossing, or maybe long before, back in whatever house she'd grown up in with a brother who always knew where she kept things. She watched him the way a trapped animal watches, tracking every move he made across that small room, and Harlan did not take it personally, because it was only sense. She did not know him. He was the size of a bear and twice as scarred, and she was flat on her back in his bed in a cabin she could not leave, and the fact that he had not hurt her yet was not the same, in her experience, as the promise that he would not. So he was careful, not gentle. He did not have gentle in him, but careful. He kept his distance when he could. He told her before he did things. He never once touched her that he did not have to, and when he had to, he said so first, and then he did it plain and quick and took his hands away. And slowly, the watching eased. It eased the day he handed her the repeater. She had asked him 100 questions about the country, in her dry, flat way, filing everything, the way a person does who intends to survive a place and knows that survival is mostly information. How deep does it drift? How long does the winter run? What's out there in the timber? And on that last one, Harlan had looked at her a moment, and then taken the heavy repeating rifle down off its pegs by the door and carried it over and laid it across the foot of the bed. Wolves, mostly, he said. Cats, sometimes men, once in a great while, though not in this snow. He nodded at the gun. You know how to use one of those? No, I'll teach you. When you can stand. He left it lying there. Till then, it stays where you can reach it. Loaded, so you'll quit lying there all night listening for my breathing to change. Cora looked at the rifle. Then she looked at him. This enormous, frightening man who had just handed a woman who flinched every time he moved a loaded weapon and set it within her reach, so that she could sleep. She did not say thank you. She was not a woman who said thank you easily, and he was not a man who would have known what to do with it. But that night, for the first time, Harlan heard her breathing go deep and slow and even a few feet from his chair, and he knew she had finally, actually, slept. He built her a splint for the collarbone out of 2 pieces of cedar and strips of an old shirt. He cooked, badly, and she ate all of it. He talked, when he talked at all, in short flat statements about weather and wood and what needed doing. And she answered in the same coin. And somewhere in the exchange of all that plainness a strange thing began to happen. They started to fit. Not the way the catalog had promised, not calico and quiet companionship, something rougher and truer than that. 2 hard people who had each been handed a raw deal by the world, sharing the work of not freezing to death and finding, to the surprise of them both, that the work went easier split 2 ways. He would come in from the trap line with his beard frozen and his hands cracked, and there would be a fire built up and coffee on, because she had learned the stove. She would wake in the night coughing, the last of the sickness working out of her chest, and there would be a cup of the bitter willow bark waiting warm on the stool, because he had heard the cough start and gotten up before she was fully awake. Neither of them named any of it. Naming a thing makes it real, and real things can be lost, and both of these two had lost enough to be careful about it. But the second chair was full now. Of an evening, she sat in it across the table from him, wrapped in his spare wool coat, her green eyes catching the firelight, and Harlan Mercer would look at that chair with a woman finally in it, after 3 months of it facing him empty, and feel a thing in his chest he did not have a word for, and did not go looking for one. He mentioned the chair to her. Once, in February, told her he'd built it before he'd ever laid eyes on her. 2 evenings' work, good pine. Cora ran her hand along the smoothed arm of it. "You planed it," she said. "Most men wouldn't have bothered. For a woman they hadn't met. Figured whoever came ought to have a chair that wasn't going to give her splinters," Harlan said. Cora was quiet a while. "Nobody ever built me anything before," she said. To the fire. "In my whole life. Not one thing." She turned the words over like she was surprised to hear herself say them out loud. "There was always a reason," she went on. "Money was tight, or the timing was bad, or I hadn't earned it, or I'd only break it. My mother used to say I was a girl who broke things. Arthur, he'd take a thing I cared about and hold it up where I could see it, and then..." She stopped. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Harlan said. Cora looked at him across the little table, across the 2 chairs. "He'd break it," she said simply, "whatever it was, just to watch my face, and then tell me I'd done it. And after a while I stopped caring about things, because caring about a thing was just handing him something to break. It's easier not to want anything. You can't lose what you never let yourself have." Harlan sat with that a while. He knew something about it. He had built a whole life at 9,000 feet on that exact principle. "That's a hard way to live," he said. "It's the only way I knew," she said. "Until a man I'd never met built me a chair." And she did not say anything else, and neither did he, but something settled in that cabin that night, quiet and permanent, like snow filling in a set of tracks until the ground is smooth and whole again. He watched her, some evenings, when she was not looking. He watched her learn, slowly, that she was allowed to want things. It started small. She admired a horn spoon he'd carved, and he told her to keep it, and she held it a moment like she was waiting for the catch, for the hand to come and take it back. And when the hand did not come, she put it in her pocket and kept it there. She started leaving her few small things out in the open, a hair comb, a ribbon, instead of hidden, because there was no one in that cabin who would take a thing just to watch her face. It was a small country, that cabin, 10 feet by 10. But it was. Harlan came to understand over that long winter, the first place Cora had ever lived where nothing she loved was going to be used against her. And that, more than the salt pork or the willow bark or the warm stove, was the thing that healed her. The winter did its worst, and they held. They snowshoed the trapline together once she was strong enough, and she turned out to have a good eye for sign and a steadier hand than he'd expected. They rationed the flour when the flour ran low, and they made it last. They killed a deer that wandered close to the cabin half-starved in a February thaw, and they used the whole of it, and it carried them. She learned to shoot. She was good at it. Harlan stood behind her in the snow with his big hands not quite touching her shoulders, telling her about the wind and the breath and the slow squeeze, and she put 3 rounds into a blaze on a pine at 40 yards, and turned around with something on her face that he had not seen there before. It took him a second to place it, because it had been so long since he had seen it on anybody, including in a looking glass. It was the look of a person beginning, cautiously, to believe they might get to live. There was one night that winter that neither of them ever forgot. It came in the deep of February, in the worst of the cold, when the snow had piled to the eaves and the game had gone scarce and desperate. The wolves came down out of the high country that year, hungrier than Harlan had seen them in a long time, and one night, late, the mule began to scream in the lean-to. Harlan was up and had the repeater off its pegs before he was fully awake. Cora was up behind him, wrapped in the wool coat, and she did not ask what was happening, because she had already heard it, the low coughing chorus out in the dark, circling, "Stay in," Harlan said, and went out into the snow in his shirt sleeves. There were 4 of them, gaunt and gray and half mad with hunger, and they had the mule backed into the corner of the lean-to, and they were not afraid of him the way wolves are supposed to be afraid of a man, because hunger burns the fear out of anything, given enough of it. He got a shot into one, and it went down, and the others scattered back into the dark, but they did not go far. He could hear them out past the firelight, circling, waiting for him to run out of nerve or lead or cold-numbed fingers, and the mule was wild-eyed and lunging, and the wind was taking the heat out of him fast. And then the cabin door opened, and Cora came out into the snow beside him, and she had the second rifle, the old single shot he kept by the bed, and she set her back against his without a word, facing the dark he could not face, so that between the 2 of them there was no side left open. They held that lean-to for the better part of an hour, the 2 of them back to back in the killing cold, and when the wolves finally understood that this was 2 guns and not 1, and that neither of them was going to break, they melted back up the mountain and did not come again. Harlan got the mule quieted, and the 2 of them went back inside, shaking with cold, and Cora built the fire up while Harlan saw to a gash one of them had opened on his forearm, and neither of them said much. But at the door, before she went to her side of the room, Cora stopped. "You went out there for a mule," she said. "Good mule," Harlan said. "You'd have gone out there for me," she said. It was not a question. She had seen his back set against the dark, and she had understood, standing behind him with a rifle, exactly what kind of man puts himself between a hungry thing and the person behind him. Harlan looked at her across the firelit room. "Yeah," he said, "I would have." And that was all either of them said about it. But she did not set the rifle back down between their beds that night, the way she had every night since the first. She set it by the door, where a thing goes when you no longer think you might need it against the person you're sharing a roof with. The thaw came in the last week of March, sudden and loud, the way it does in that country. The snow went off the south slopes first. The creek came up and ran brown and roaring. The world, which had been sealed and silent and white for 4 months, cracked open and started moving again. And with the world open again, the trail down the mountain opened too, which meant the trail up it opened as well. Harlan was splitting wood in the yard on a warm, bright afternoon, in his shirt sleeves for the first time since November, when the mule threw its head up and stared down the trail, and its ears came forward, and Harlan set down the axe and went still, because he had lived up here 10 years and he trusted that mule's ears over his own eyes. A rider was coming up the switchbacks. Harlan did not call out to the cabin. He walked, unhurried, to where the axe leaned, and he picked it up, and he stood it against the chopping block where his hand would fall on it, and he waited. The rider came up out of the last of the timber into the clearing. A lean man on a hired horse, town clothes, a soft hat, a hard face gone raw and peeling from 3 days on the trail. He was not built for this country, and it showed on him. He drew rein at the edge of the yard and looked at Harlan Mercer, at the size of him, at the axe near his hand, and something flickered behind his eyes and was quickly put away. "I'm looking for a woman," the man said. "Came west on the stage before the snow. My sister. I have reason to believe she came up this way." Behind Harlan, the cabin door opened. He did not turn around. He watched the man's face instead, and he saw it change, saw the recognition land, saw the ugly flicker of it, and Harlan Mercer knew exactly who was sitting his horse in the yard before the man said one more word. "Cora," the rider said, and put on a smile that did not reach any part of him. "Thank God. I have been half out of my mind. There was a mix-up at the crossing. We were separated in the weather. I have been searching everywhere, Arthur," said Cora's voice, from the doorway, flat and dead level. And Harlan turned then, slow, and looked at her. She had come out onto the step. She had the repeater in her hands, held low but held right, the way he had taught her feet set, her green eyes clear and cold and entirely without fear. She did not look like a casualty anymore. "You left me under a tree to die," Cora said. "You put your boot in my ribs, and you took the coat off my back for the gold in the lining, and you left me in the snow. And now the snow's melted, and here you are, come to see whether there's anything left worth taking." Arthur's smile fell off his face like a mask off a nail. "You've got no idea what you're talking about," he started. "You were sick. You were out of your head. You don't remember it right. I remember it exactly right," she said. Arthur's hand moved toward his coat. He was fast. He was faster than a soft town man had any right to be, and Harlan was 10 feet away with an axe and no gun. And for one long, stretched-out second, it hung in the balance. But Cora had been sleeping 4 months with a loaded repeater in reach, and she had put 3 rounds into a blaze on a pine at 40 yards, and Arthur was 10 feet off and standing still. She did not shoot him. That is the part Harlan told in later years, on the rare occasions he told it at all. She had every right in the world, and she did not do it. She put a round into the dirt 6 inches in front of his horse, and levered the next one in before the echo came back off the ridge, and the horse came near to throwing him. And by the time he had it back under him, he was looking down the barrel of a rifle held rock-steady by a woman who had learned, up here, exactly what she was made of. "The gold's gone," Cora said. "You spent it. Or you lost it, I don't care which. There's nothing up here for you, Arthur. There's no money, and there's no frightened sister, and there's no soft place left in me for you to know about." Her voice did not shake. "Get off this mountain, and if I ever see your face again, I will not shoot the ground." Arthur Mercer. No, Harlan thought, watching. Arthur, whatever his name truly was, looked at his sister a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face was enough. Because the fight went out of him, and the contempt curdled into something small and mean and beaten. And he turned his hired horse without another word and put it back down the switchbacks toward the valley. They watched him go until the timber took him. Then Cora lowered the rifle, and Harlan saw that her hands were shaking now that it was over, the way a body shakes when the thing that needed doing is finally done. He crossed the yard to her. He did not know, even now, how to be gentle, but he had learned a few things over one long winter about being careful. He put one big scarred hand over both of hers, on the barrel of the rifle, and he stilled the shaking. "That's the last of it," he said. "He won't come back. Men like that don't come back once they've been looked at straight." He looked down at her. "You looked at him straight." Cora let out a long, shuddering breath, and something she had been carrying since before Miller's Crossing, since long before, went out of her on it. "I've been afraid of him my whole life," she said. "I know it," Harlan said. "I'm not anymore." She said it like she was testing whether it was true, and then again, steadier, like she had found that it was. "I'm not anymore." They stood in the yard a while, in the warm, loud thawing world, and then they went back inside, into the cabin, and Harlan set the rifle back on its pegs, and Cora went to the stove, and there were 2 chairs at the table. And that evening, both of them were full. The spring came on green and violent, the way it does after a hard winter. Harlan ran his trap line down to nothing and hung up the traps for the season and turned his hand to the ground. Because a man cannot eat fur, and there is a growing season even at 9,000 feet if a person is stubborn about it. Cora turned out to know things about growing food that Harlan did not. From the parlor life she had fled, and between his stubbornness and her knowing, they put in a garden that had no business existing that high. And it grew. They did not talk about the catalog, or the $50, or the proxy agency in Chicago that had matched a lonely miner to a woman whose brother meant to rob them both. There did not seem to be any point in it. That was a transaction and a swindle, and it had brought them together the way a broken wagon axle brings 2 strangers together on a road by accident and misfortune. What grew up between them afterward was not a transaction. It grew the way the garden grew, slowly and against the odds, and tended every day by 2 people who had each decided, without ever announcing it, that they were done being alone. He married her properly in June, when the pass cleared enough to bring a circuit preacher up the mountain. It was not much of a wedding. The preacher, the mule, a jay complaining in a pine. Cora wore a dress she had made over the winter from cloth Harlan had freighted up special, and it was pale green, the color of new pine needles, the color of her eyes, and when the preacher asked Harlan Mercer whether he would take this woman, Harlan looked at her a long moment before he answered. "I have been meaning to," he said, "since about the 2nd week of the winter." Yes. And the preacher, who had married a good many frontier couples and had learned to read them, smiled and finished it, and rode back down the mountain, and left the 2 of them up there in the high green country with their garden and their cabin and their 2 chairs. There was a dog again. By the end of that first summer, it came up out of the valley the way the last one had, half wild and rib-thin, and it stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the 2 of them a long while. Deciding, Harlan looked back at it and did not chase it off. Cora set a plate of scraps out on the step and did not crowd it, because she of all people understood a creature that had learned to expect the raised hand. It took the dog 3 days to come to the plate, and a week to come to the fire, and by the first snow it was lying by the stove where the old one used to lie. In the one warm spot in the whole hard country, and Harlan Mercer had a thing he talked to again that was not the wind. Cora watched him with the dog one evening, this enormous scarred man, letting a half-wild animal lean its whole weight against his leg, and she understood something about the man she had married that he would never have found the words for himself. He was not a hard man. He had only built a hard shell, the same as she had, for the same reason, out of the same losses. And the shell had been a lie the whole time. There had been a man under it all along who let stray dogs come to his fire and built chairs for women he had never met, hoping. Just hoping. That is the thing under all of it. A hard man on a hard mountain, hoping, in the only way he had left, that the world might send him somebody to fill the empty chair. And it had, in the cruelest possible way, half dead and beaten and left in the snow. The world had finally sent her up the mountain. Now think about that second chair, friend, before we leave these 2. A lonely man built it. He sat across from it, empty, for 3 months. And empty is a hard thing to sit across from, harder than an empty room, because an empty chair is a promise that has not been kept. He had ordered a wife from a catalog because he had run clean out of any other way to fill it, and what came up that mountain in his arms in a killing blizzard was not a wife at all. It was a dying woman, beaten near to death, and left in the snow by her own blood. A casualty of the world's plain cruelty, and every hard practical instinct the mountain had taught him told him to let her go. Because she was too far gone, and because saving her would cost him more than he had. He saved her anyway. Not because he was a hero. He was not one, and would have been offended to be called one. He saved her because somewhere under 10 years of frostbite and cynicism there was a thing in him that could not, in the end, walk away from a person left to die in the snow. That is all heroism ever really is, when you get down under it. It is a person who could walk away, and doesn't. And she, who had every reason in the world to trust no man ever again, who had been robbed and beaten and left for dead by the one person on earth who was supposed to love her, she let herself, slowly and carefully and against everything her life had taught her, be saved. And then, when the thaw came and her brother came up the mountain to finish it, she stood on that step with a rifle in her hands, and she was not afraid anymore. That is the harder thing. Being saved is not the hard part. Letting yourself be saved is the hard part, when the world has taught you that everyone who reaches for you means to take something. She learned it anyway, one careful day at a time, in a 10-by-10 box of pine. 2 people the world had thrown away. 1 empty chair, and a man who kept it planed smooth and waiting year after year for someone who might never come. And 1 long winter, in a 10-by-10 box of pine at the top of the world that turned 2 casualties into something neither of them had dared to order out of any catalog, because there was no catalog on earth that carried it. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell us in the comments, do you think Harlan should have walked away when everything sensible told him to? And where in the world are you listening from? We read every single one of them. And if you love these stories of the men and women who built whole lives out of nothing but hard ground and stubborn hearts up in the high wild country, settle in and stay a while. Like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to Ride Along with us, because there is a new story waiting by the fire every single week. Thank you for sitting with us. We will see you up the trail.